There are places on this earth that seem to hold their breath, waiting for a witness who never arrives. Peak 402 is one of those places. A jagged limestone tooth rising from a sea of pines, where the maps offer only empty white space, and the silence is heavy enough to feel. What follows is not a legend, but a series of entries recovered from a place that, by all accounts, should have been empty for decades. The climb to the lookout station takes 6 hours of steady trekking through a forest that grows increasingly still as the elevation rises. At 5,000 feet, the birds stop their chatter, leaving only the rhythmic crunch of boots on dry needles and the distant metallic hum of the wind. The air here is thin and tastes of cold stone, carrying the faint scent of ozone that precedes a mountain storm. The station itself is a skeleton of silvered wood and reinforced glass, perched precariously on a shelf of granite. It has stood since the late 50s, a relic of a time when men were paid to sit in the clouds and watch for the first wisp of smoke. Now, the paint is peeling like dead skin, and the windows are clouded with a permanent frost that refuses to melt, even in the July sun. Inside, the space is cramped and smells of old paper and kerosene, a frozen capsule of a life lived in isolation. A single iron cot sits in the corner, its springs protesting with a high-pitched whine at the slightest touch. On the heavy oak desk, a decommissioned shortwave radio sits like a silent altar, its dials frozen, and its vacuum tubes dark with age. The first few days were spent in the rhythmic labor of restoration, scrubbing away the grime of years and cataloging the remaining supplies. There is a strange comfort in the solitude, a sense of being the only living soul in a world made of clouds and rock. At night, the stars are so bright they seem to vibrate, casting long, distorted shadows across the floor of the cabin. It was on the fourth night, while the wind was uncharacteristically still, that the radio began to hum. It wasn't the static of a live frequency, but a deep, resonant vibration that felt as if it were coming from the desk itself. The power was disconnected, the wires brittle and snapped, yet the green glow of the signal strength meter flickered into a ghostly life. The sound started as a faint, rhythmic tapping, like a fingernail clicking against glass in a steady, deliberate pattern. It didn't follow the frantic pace of Morse code or the chaotic tumble of atmospheric interference. It was slow, patient, and perfectly timed with the pulse of light from the distant lighthouse on the coast, miles beyond the range of sight. As the tapping continued, the clouds began to roll into the valley below, thick and white like a rising tide of milk. Each time a cloud bank shifted or crested over a ridge, the rhythm of the radio changed, its pitch rising and falling in response to the vapor. It was as if the mountain were translating the movement of the sky into a language made of percussion. Sleep became a secondary concern, as the patterns grew more complex, weaving a sonic tapestry that filled the small room. I found myself sitting in the dark for hours, my hand resting on the cold metal casing of the radio, feeling the vibrations travel up my arm. There was no malice in the sound, only a profound, ancient loneliness that seemed to echo the emptiness of the surrounding peaks. By dawn, the signal faded into a low thrum that drifted into the morning wind, leaving the cabin wrapped in a ringing silence. I stepped out onto the catwalk, the mist clinging to my clothes like damp wool, and looked toward the summit. For the first time, I noticed a series of stone cairns, neatly stacked pillars of rock that hadn't been there when I arrived. They were spaced at perfect intervals along the ridgeline, leading upward toward the highest point of peak 402, where the clouds were thickest. Each cairn was topped with a flat piece of slate, etched with symbols that looked less like writing and more like the jagged lines of a seismograph. They were weathered, smoothed by decades of ice and wind, yet they felt intentional and fresh. I followed the trail of stones, my breath hitching in the thin air as the trail narrowed to a thin ribbon of scree. The silence here was different than in the woods below. It was a physical weight, a pressure against the eardrums that made the world feel small and muffled. Every few yards, I would stop and listen, half expecting to hear the radio's tapping echoing from the rocks. Near the third cairn, partially buried under a slide of shale, I spotted the strap of a heavy canvas bag. It was stiff with age and stained by the minerals in the soil. The brass buckles turned a deep, dull green. As I pulled it free, the fabric groaned but held, revealing a weight inside that felt solid and precious in the wasteland of stone. Inside the satchel was a surveyor's journal, its leather cover cracked and bleached white by the sun of 1,000 days. The name on the inside flap had been rubbed away, leaving only a date, August 1954. The pages were filled with meticulous drawings of the horizon and long columns of numbers that seemed to track the barometric pressure with obsessive detail. I sat on a flat boulder, the wind whipping the edges of the yellowed paper as I began to read the final entries. The handwriting started as a neat professional script, but toward the end, it devolved into wide looping strokes that skipped across the page. The surveyor wasn't mapping the land, he was mapping the sounds he heard, coming from the earth beneath his feet. He wrote of a frequency of the earth, a tone so low it could only be felt in the marrow of the bones. He claimed it wasn't a broadcast from a man-made source, but a tectonic respiration, the mountain breathing through the vents in the rock. According to his notes, the signal was a warning, or perhaps a greeting, meant only for those who climbed high enough to listen. The last legible sentence was written in a hand so shaky it was nearly impossible to decipher. It spoke of a moment when the birds and the wind would cease and the great stillness would finally arrive to claim its due. As I reached the end of the paragraph, a quiet shadow drifted across the page, though there were no clouds above me to block the sun. I looked up and realized the wind had vanished entirely, leaving the tall pines below as motionless as a photograph. There was no rustle of grass, no creak of the station's timber, and no sound of my own quickening breath. The entire mountain had become a vacuum of sound, a void where the only thing remaining was the rhythmic tapping starting again. This time, coming from inside the rocks. Standing among the silent cairns, the weight of the mountain seemed to double, pressing against my chest with an invisible force. The stillness was so absolute that it felt as if time itself had snagged on a jagged peak and torn, leaving the present moment suspended in a vacuum. Every muscle in my body tensed, waiting for a sound, any sound, to break the oppressive quiet of the summit. The tapping from the rocks was not a sharp metallic strike, but a deep, resonant thud that vibrated through the soles of my boots. It felt as if a giant heart were beating slowly deep within the granite, pulsing with a rhythm that was ancient and deliberate. I knelt to touch the ground, and the stone felt unnervingly warm, as if it had been basking in a sun that hadn't shone for centuries. I opened the surveyor's journal again, my fingers trembling as I flipped back through the earlier, more coherent entries. He had sketched the cairns with mathematical precision, noting their alignment with specific star clusters that only appeared in the autumn sky. Beside one sketch, he had scribbled a single word over and over in the margins: resonance. According to his notes, the cairns weren't mere markers. They were acoustic dampeners, designed to focus the mountain's internal vibrations toward the lookout station. He believed the entire ridge had been shaped by hands much older than the Forest Service to act as a colossal tuning fork. As I read, the tapping grew louder, shifting from a rhythmic pulse into a structured series of intervals. I looked back toward the station, and for a moment, the perspective of the landscape seemed to shift and warp. The cabin appeared smaller, more distant, as if the trail I had just walked had stretched out into an impossible length. The silvered wood of the structure glinted with a strange, pearlescent light, a light that did not belong to the dull gray of the mountain afternoon. A sudden, sharp chill swept across the ridge, though the air remained perfectly still, and the pines stayed frozen. It was a cold that started in the center of the cairns and radiated outward, bringing with it the smell of wet earth and prehistoric ice. I felt a sudden, inexplicable urge to dismantle the stones, to break the circuit that the surveyor had so carefully documented. As I reached for the top stone of the nearest cairn, the radio in the distant cabin let out a shriek of feedback that echoed across the valley. It was a sound that shouldn't have been possible at that distance, a piercing electronic wail that sliced through the silence like a blade. I pulled my hand back, and the feedback instantly smoothed into a melodic, low-frequency hum. I began the descent back to the station, my heart hammering against my ribs in a frantic counterpoint to the mountain's pulse. The trail felt unfamiliar, the rocks beneath my feet shifting in ways they hadn't on the way up, as if the mountain were rearranging itself. Every shadow in the crevice of the cliffs seemed to lengthen, reaching out toward the path with dark, misty fingers. When I finally reached the catwalk of the lookout, the door was standing wide open, swinging slowly on its hinges, even though there was no wind at all. Inside, the cabin was filled with a thick, swirling fog, a fog that hid the floor and softened the light drifting in from the windows. The shortwave radio was glowing, a fierce emerald green, the glass of its vacuum tubes vibrating so intensely they hummed. On the desk, the dust had been disturbed, cleared away in a perfect circle around the base of the radio. And within that circle, a series of small, dark pebbles had been arranged in the same pattern as the cairns on the ridge. I hadn't brought any stones back with me, yet there they were, cold and wet, as if they had just been plucked from a stream. The radio speakers began to emit a voice, not a human voice, but a composite of sounds that mimicked the cadence of speech. It used the whistle of the wind, the crackle of dry wood, and the hum of the transformer to create a series of haunting, hollow syllables. It didn't speak words I recognized, but the meaning was clear. I was no longer a visitor. I was a part of the broadcast. I grabbed the logbook from the desk to record what was happening, but the ink in my pen refused to flow, as though the gravity in the room had gently and impossibly reversed. I looked toward the surveyor's journal, and the pages were now blank, the ink having vanished from the paper, as if it had never been written at all. The history of Peak 402 was being erased, rewritten, by the very frequency it had tried so carefully to document. I sat on the iron cot, watching the emerald glow of the radio pulse in time with the thumping in the floorboards. The fog in the room began to take on shapes, shadowy figures that stood at the edge of my vision, only to vanish when I turned to face them. They didn't feel like ghosts. They felt like echoes, remnants of others who had sat in this same chair, listening to the same signal. The sun began to dip below the horizon, but the sky didn't turn orange or red. It faded into a deep, bruised purple, a color that felt heavy and quietly suffocating. Above, the stars did not appear in their usual constellations. They formed new shapes, geometric patterns that pulsed gently in time with the radio's soft hum. And the world outside the glass was no longer the wilderness I knew. It had become a landscape of static and shadow. I realized then that the frequency of the earth wasn't a sound at all, but a shift in reality that the mountain quietly, patiently facilitated. Those who stayed at Peak 402 long enough didn't just hear the signal, they became tuned to it, their own frequencies slowly aligning with the stone and the sky. The silence wasn't the absence of sound, but the presence of something so vast so all-encompassing, it drowned out everything else. The tapping from the rocks started again, but this time it was coming from the walls of the cabin, a steady knocking on the wood. It was the same rhythm I had heard on the ridge, but it was faster now, more urgent, as if something were trying to get in. Or perhaps something was trying to get out. I looked at the door, and the fog was spilling over the threshold, like a living thing. I reached out to close the door, but my hand passed through the handle, as though it were made of smoke. And as I looked down at my reflection in the darkened window, I saw my features, blurred, the edges of my silhouette shimmering with the same green light as the radio. The transformation the surveyor had feared was already nearly complete, and the mountain was finally ready to speak. The emerald light from the radio began to bleed into the wood of the walls, turning the cabin into a translucent cage of vibrating energy. I tried to stand, but the floor felt as fluid as a mountain lake, undulating with every rhythmic thud that rose from the granite foundations. The shadows in the corners finally stepped forward, and I realized they weren't people at all, but columns of shifting mist that held the vague, lingering shape of human curiosity. I looked down at the surveyor's journal, and while the pages remained white, new lines began to etch themselves into the paper, slowly, quietly, without the touch of a pen. The lines were not letters, but a map of the valley, a map that showed paths leading into the earth rather than across it. These were the lost trails the surveyor had whispered about, routes that opened only when the mountain reached its perfect resonant pitch. Stop here. The radio's voice grew into a singular, sustained note, one that seemed to vibrate every atom in the room, harmonizing gently with the humming in my teeth. Outside the glass, the pines began to dissolve into streaks of vertical light, and the mountain ridge stretched upward until the stars were within arm's reach. The physical world was being unmade, replaced by the raw data of the signal, a realm where geometry and sound were the only truths. I felt a sudden, sharp clarity, a realization that the great stillness wasn't an end, but a transition into a different kind of existence. The fear that had gripped me for hours vanished, replaced by a calm, reflective acceptance that this peak was never meant for the living. It was a relay station for something much older, a place where the earth whispered its secrets to the stars, through the medium of the lonely. With a final, deafening thud from the floorboards, the cabin door slammed shut, and the emerald light reached a blinding intensity. My hands, now nearly transparent, rested on the oak desk as the vibration reached its crescendo, pulling the very essence of my memory into the frequency. The station, the radio, and the cairns all seemed to exhale at once, releasing a sigh that echoed through the valley like a dying storm. When the light finally faded, the cabin was once again a dark, quiet skeleton of silvered wood and cold glass. The radio sat silent on the desk, its vacuum tubes shattered, and its dials rusted as if they hadn't been turned in a century. The fog had vanished from the room, leaving behind only the scent of old paper and the lingering chill of a high-altitude night. The moon rose over Peak 402, casting a pale, indifferent light over the empty iron cot and the dust-covered floor. There was no sign of a struggle, no footprints in the dust, and no satchel containing a surveyor's journal. The lookout station was as it had always been, a lonely outpost at the edge of the world, waiting for the next witness to climb the ridge. Far below in the valley, a lone hiker might look up and see a single green spark flicker briefly in the high windows of the station. They might hear a faint rhythmic tapping on the wind, like a fingernail clicking against glass, before the silence of the woods swallows it whole. But the hiker will keep walking, for some signals are meant to be heard only by those who are already lost. The mountains do not keep records of who passes through them. They only remember the songs they were taught to sing. If you find yourself on peak 402 when the wind dies down, do not reach for the radio. Some silences are best left undisturbed.